You very much. Just a couple of comments before we get rolling. Today's episode is going to deal with the immigrants of Crested Butte. I mean, all those people came from Southeastern Europe or Northwestern Europe early in the game, and it's kind of near and dear to my heart. Next week is our final segment, and I thought that it would be most appropriate that we would talk about the coal mining of Crested Butte, the thing that made Crested Butte famous as a great coal mining community. Really appreciate the three sponsors that Ashley has mentioned. We will have a trivia question at the end, and whoever wins it answers the question correctly. We'll have two questions. We'll get a book on Crested Butte, and I've sent them out in the mail. I think everybody has gotten them. As Ashley mentioned, December the 28th, Christmas polka party here at the museum. Right now, we got 179 people registered. I thank all of you. It's great to have you on board. So tonight, we're going to talk about the immigrants of Crested Butte. And as I said, it's near and dear to my heart. There you get a good look at the big mine in Crested Butte when it was going hot dog from 1894 to 1952. The reason that the immigration is near and dear to my heart is my grandfather was born in a suburb of Antwerp, Belgium. He came over on the boat in 1919. My father and my grandmother and two sisters followed in 1920. And I grew up in a Belgian farming community at a place called St. Nicholas in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And I think I've mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. I grew up in an area where everybody spoke a foreign language, Dutch, Walloon, Flemish, and everybody also spoke in a clipped accent. When I came to Gunnison, fall of 1962, I thought I'd buzz up to Crested Butte, didn't know anybody, never been here before, maybe have a glass of beer with some of the locals, and I came up here and everybody was speaking a foreign language in a clipped accent. And I said to myself, Vandenbush, you are home. And it's been home for me ever since. Immigration is the oldest and most continuous industry or group of people that we have in U.S. history. And the United States, with the Statue of Liberty, says a lot about that. And I'm going to quote the words of the Statue of Liberty. Everybody knows the last two or three lines, but maybe not the whole thing. So it goes something like this. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, her mild eyes command. The air bridge harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied prompt, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Immigrants came to the United States because of a variety of reasons. One involved foreign wars in their country. Secondly, hard times. Third, the class system that they had there, they never could rise out of. And lastly, hope. From 1865 to 1900, 33 million immigrants came to the U.S., and they made enormous contributions, and the United States became the melting pot of nations, nation of immigrants. The contributions they made were many. Number one, they did the back-breaking work that people in the United States didn't want to do. Number two, they made the United States the richest culture in the world, the melting pot. And number three, they increased the population and settled in wilderness areas that no one else wanted to go into, such as the Great Plains, the Great American Desert. The old immigration came from Northwestern Europe after the Civil War, came from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Scandinavia, and Germany. They were WASPs, white, Anglo, Saxon, Protestant, Cousin Jacks and Cousin Jennies. The men were called Cousin Jacks because if anybody got killed in a mine explosion or a mine disaster, they would walk up to the boss and say, my cousin Jack can do that, and another man was on the way. Their wives were called Cousin Jennies. Most of these old immigrants were Protestant. and most of them spoke the English language. They were kind of respectable people. Many went into farming in the Great Lakes in the Midwest, and others became some of the best hard rock miners in the world. Those in Wales that worked in the tin mines for 7 centuries. In the 1860s, when Colorado's complex ore couldn't be reduced, the gold couldn't really be reduced, a man named Nathan Hill went over to Wales, and he said, if these guys can't reduce the gold ore onto a copper mat or a copper base, it can't be done. And the people of Wales were able to do it. And a couple of years later, Nathan Hill made the final separation, saving the gold industry of Colorado. The old immigrants came earliest, right after the Civil War, as I've mentioned. The new immigration came a little later in the 1880s and the 1890s, and they were from Southeastern Europe, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the Ottoman Empire, from the Russian Empire. They were called Slovenians, Slovakians, Serbians, Czechs, and Italians. They came to the cities and the coal mines. There were more Poles in Chicago than in any other city in the world, and that includes Poland. There were more Jews in New York City than any other city in the world, and that includes Israel. The early view of immigrants was that they would conform to Anglo-Saxon patterns of behavior and be assimilated, learn how to speak the English language, adopt U.S. customs. That's how I grew up. My grandfather, I asked my father one time why my grandpa didn't want to go back to Belgium and see his brothers and some of the relatives. And my father said, because he fears that if he goes back, a war is going to break out and he won't be able to get back in the U.S. My grandfather always referred to Belgium as the old country. And there were a lot of reasons why he left, good reasons, and he was very happy to be in the U.S. Later views wanted immigrants to maintain their identities. Certainly we have that view today. Mary Anton, one of the great immigrants, said, "We came not empty-handed here, but brought a rich inheritance." Some of the immigrants who made great contributions in the United States: Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone; Joseph Pulitzer, the great journalist; Nikola Tesla, most brilliant man who ever existed in electricity; Louis Agassiz, who wrote a great work of paintings called Birds of North America; John Peter Altgeld, who ascended to be the governor of Illinois; Joseph Reese, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, about New York tenement houses; Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor; Andrew Carnegie, the great steel magnate; and E.V. Rolvog, whose family later on became the governor of Minnesota, and very prominent people in Minnesota. A reaction against immigration in the United States came very early. Labor opposed it because of too many workers and small wages. Social reformers opposed immigration because most of those people moved into the slums, had poor public health, were exploited by as poor. As long as illiterate immigration came into the city, you weren't going to be able to up the standards. And finally, you had a bunch of Nordic supremacists, WASPs, who thought they were better than these poor Southeastern European immigrants coming into the U.S. and Crested Butte. The way to keep immigrants out was by passing literacy tests and passing federal laws with quotas like the Immigration Acts of 1917 and 1924. You got a good look at the coke ovens of Crested Butte. A little more about that later on. The early foreigners who came to Crested Butte were from Canada, such as Alan Fred Johnson, who came from the San Laurentian Mountains out of Quebec. They also came out of Norway and Sweden and from the British Isles, and they had names like Ross and McCluskey and McNeil and Gardner. Many came from the coal mines of England and Ireland and the tin mines of Wales. And their boys went into the mines at the age of 8 or 9 and never lived. Many of them never lived outside of being in the dark. They went into the mines early in the morning at dark, and they came out at dark, and many of them worked 7 days a week. and many of them died of coal dust in the lungs at the age of 19. 3 barbaric rules existed with respect to the coal miners then. Number 1 was the rule of contributory negligence. If you got hurt in a coal mine, well, you contributed to your own negligence, so sue yourself. Secondly, the fellow servant rule. If your fellow servant caused an accident that hurt you, sue him. And number 3 barbaric rule was called the rule of risk. If you worked in a coal mine or a foundry or on the railroad, you assumed the risk. That was a dangerous job. If you got hurt, well, it was your own fault. One of the great movies ever was one called How Green Was My Valley. Won the Academy Award in the late 1930s about coal mining in Ireland. Large numbers of immigrants were attracted by the gold and silver mines in the U.S. in the 1870s and 80s, the Cousin Jacks and the Cousin Jennies. For the first 15 years in Crested Butte, almost all the people came from the British Isles, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Ireland. That began to change when railroads entered the Gunnison country in the early 1880s. Denver Rio Grande coming in from Denver over Marshall Pass, the Denver South Park coming through the Alpine Tunnel, 1881 and 1882. As the Denver Rio Grande laid tracks west of Gunnison into the Black Canyon, Irish and Italian laborers working for the railroad did not have much like for each other. In October of 81 in the canyon, an Austrian worker named Pete Theophile, after not being paid on time and being hit by his boss, William Hoblitzel, shot the contractor in the breast with a pistol, killing him. Theophile fled in the canyon, 7 miles down, but soon was caught by George Ewell, the sheriff of Gunnison, and his deputies. And he was taken to Gunnison, lodged in the Gunnison courthouse for his safety. Unfortunately, around midnight, 20 armed men who were masked took him from the courthouse, dragged him to a livery stable on West Amici Avenue, where he was hung on the side of Crook's livery barn. Some of the men who hung the individual were never found out. Nobody ever found out who they were. All of the miners killed in the Jokerville coal mine explosion in Crested Butte in January of 1884, which killed 61, were all from the British Isles. A few immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire of southeastern Europe came to Crested Butte by the mid-1880s. They included Jay Kochever, Stephen Jelenik, John Pasic, Matt Malensik Sr., and Joe Rosman. They were all from Slovenia. There were 3 empires in Europe in the late 1800s, and all were fading badly. The Austrian Empire with Vienna as the capital, the Ottoman Empire with Istanbul the capital, and then the Russian Empire with Moscow the capital. There you get a good look at some of the Italians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who migrated to Crested Butte, cutting grain with sickles. All of those empires were populated by different ethnic groups, many of whom lived in different valleys, and each valley hated each other. Ethnic division, along with Muslim versus Christian, kept them apart and fighting with each other. These minorities included Slovakians, Bulgarians, Slovenians, Serbians, Italians, Bosnians, Herzegovinians, Czechs, and Armenians. Lord Turgot, the finance minister of France, once said this of these ethnic minorities: they were like fruit on trees. When they ripened, they dropped off. In other words, they didn't want to be controlled as colonial people by an empire forever. Voltaire, the great Frenchman, once said, "Nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time had come." And the idea in Southeastern Europe in the 80s and 90s were freedom and liberty, and these people wanted it. However, the empires always believed in order first and liberty second. All 3 of the empires had accumulated territory throughout the years by conquest, by marriage, by luck, and by support from the Catholic Church. All of the minorities, as I said, hated each other, and they all had their own different religion and art and music and customs. We call that philology, the folk spirit of a people. All of the people in the empires were poor agricultural people, mostly Catholic, speaking a foreign language, and often working in orchards, vineyards, dairy farms. They came to the U.S. in search of a better way of life. I already talked about my dad and my grandfather. I can just imagine seeing my grandfather arriving at Ellis Island, along with all the immigrants that came into Crested Butte. Little money, no speaking English, never having come to the U.S., and now trying to find their way. Those people had to be courageous. Almost all those who came into Crested Butte were from Southeastern Europe after the Cousin Jacks. Their names were Panyan, Mihelic, Saya, Capuchin, Krismanich, Spreitzer, Starika, and Sedmak. Strange sounding names. Didn't speak English, Catholic, and very little money. They were ignorant of mining, and because they were considered dumb, didn't know anything. Well, they'd never been involved with mining. They'd always been farmers. The Slavs in Crested Butte kept to themselves very early, and they crowded into a good number of boarding houses run by Slavic women. One of the women who ran a boarding house was Margaret Golubich, and she always looked at a prospective boarder's hands before accepting them. If they were not rough from work, the man was turned away. Many of those who were young and single, forced to leave family behind. Relaxation and companionship was found in the saloon. And there you see Rosich's Saloon on the west end of Elk Avenue. Now it's called the Public House. And you can see that little girl sitting there next to a spittoon. She had to be a little careful. There in the saloons, one could find many things. You could drown your sorrows. You could overcome weariness from hard and long work. You could also meet other people. You could buy a steamship ticket and money orders to send back to relatives in the old country. You could play poker. You could eat. You could dance. You could meet a girl maybe. You could also pay one's lodge and club dues, and if the saloon keeper was on friendly terms, pay one's church dues. There you get a good look at the Spreitzer family up Walrod Gulch in the 1960s. And everybody in that family really played instruments and had a great band that often played in Crested Butte. Most businessmen in Crested Butte got started by running a saloon. Martin Verju was the first Slav to open a store. He competed with 7 others, including the CF&I's big CF&I store, company store, and he grossed $90,000 in 1926. There you get a great look of Robel Strobauer and Pitzer Sporsic on the right, Milo Hauda. This is right across from the ski area of today in the 1960s, and they're all playing a little music. Johnny Rosic, another Slav, had Rosic's bar, as I've already mentioned. He came to Crested Butte at the age of 21 in 1888. Later on became a rancher and a businessman until he died in 1947. Very early, the Slavic people of Crested Butte were detested because, number one, they took jobs. Number two, they were Catholic. Number three, they spoke a foreign language. And number four, they were very suspicious when World War I broke out. There's a good little advertisement for Josiah and his orchestra playing on the 4th of July in Crested Butte in the 1950s and the 1960s. The new immigrants of Crested Butte had to learn a new job, and that job was working in the coal mines. Very difficult, very hard, and very dangerous. There's a good shot of my good friend Tony Danny, 1918, walking with newspapers right near the Crested Butte News Depot. Tony later on took up a ranch at Jack's Cabin, and today that's called the Danny Ranch. It's kind of been subdivided. Some of the workers in Crested Butte who worked in the coal mines worked on their knees because of very small coal seams. They also worked in damp, cold conditions and water. In the best conditions, they could shovel 30 tons of coal a day and make about $3 a day doing it. Periodic strikes hurt the immigrants. The first came in 1890 and led to the Italian Council in Denver to ask the Elk Mountain Pilot newspaper in Crested Butte to publish a telegram begging miners to stop the strike against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and, quote, trust in the justice of the authorities. Another strike came in 1903 when the United Mine Workers under John Mitchell called out 150,000 coal workers nationally. This led to George Bear, owner of major coal mines in the East and the head of the Reading Railroad, to say, and I quote, the rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by labor agitators, but by Christian men to whom God has given control of the property interests of the country. This led a man named Peter Dunn, who wrote under the idea of Mr. Dooley, to reply in the papers, quote, what do you think of the man in Pennsylvania who says the Lord and him as partners in a coal mine? Has he divided the profits? When George Bear got into it with Teddy Roosevelt, the president, by refusing to talk to Roosevelt and saying, well, just send your man to meet my man, Roosevelt threatened to shut the coal mines down and reopen them with the federal army. And that brought George Bear to the table. They just thought they were better than anybody else. Crested Butte women who spoke no English during the strikes learned to shout, go home scab, at strikebreakers. Sylvia Smith, a red-haired and fiery editor of the Crested Butte Weekly Citizen in the early 1900s, wrote negatively about the Slavic workers. She said, and I quote, a fracas occurred at the Croatian saloon Sunday night. A number of Emperor Joseph's former subjects got into a wholesale mix-up in debating the work or no work idea. And the fighting host would have filled the trenches with corpses if the sheriff had not been called up. Sheriff Pat Hanlon came into town and put down the strike. Paul Panion Sr. in Crested Butte in 1903 tried to rid the town of scabs gathered at the Croatian Hall Saloon. He lit the fuse to 12 sticks dynamite and was not quite able to get into the building. Instead, he hurled them into the street, blowing a huge hole there, but injuring no one. The CF&I had a company town in Crested Butte. Company store, company housing, company playground, and script. You didn't pay anybody in money, you paid them off in script, which you could redeem at the company store. The company prized a mule more than a man because a mule cost $70. For a dead man, $10 to the flower fund and another immigrant on the way. To help immigrants in Crested Butte, fraternal societies came. They were founded nationally and then they spread to Crested Butte. They wanted to preserve the culture in the Catholic Church. And there you get a good idea of the march. All these guys are dressed up in uniforms, and they are all the fraternal orders, and they are marching downtown Elk Avenue in Crested Butte in honor of a man who just died. The first fraternal order came in 1893, St. Joseph's, followed by the Slovenes, or started by the Slovenes. Then came Eagle of the Plains, Society of St. Barbara, Society of the Blessed Virgin Mary. All members paid dues, went to church, and helped out those in need. Marching came on holidays when a visiting dignitary came. The parades were colorful, flags flying, and all members in uniforms. The Catholic Church was very, very important in Crested Butte and held dances to help pay for the new St. Patrick's Church now on Maroon Avenue. Catholic Church, however, became overbearing. The priest demanded a $10 fee for saying a mass, which was considered a tithe. I'll give you my own personal operation with the Catholic Church. When I went to church, my family went to church at St. Nicholas. We had a French priest named Father Coignard. And Father Coignard ruled with an iron hand. And you put the money that you contributed to the church in an envelope with your name on it. And then at the start of Mass, Father Coignard would read the name and how much you paid. So he'd say Van Dam, $1. He couldn't pronounce dollar, so he'd say dot. And then based on how much you supported the church, you had your seats in the church. So the people who gave the most were in the front row, middle pew. The Vanderbush family was in the back row on the right side of the pew. We didn't have a lot of money in those days. Steve Krismanich Sr. set up a night school in Crested Butte, and he taught English at St. Mary's Hall. St. Mary's then bought the nice Pythias Hall in 1902 for $1,750. It was on Elk Avenue, but then the big metal-clad building was jacked up onto log rollers and dragged backwards into its present location on 2nd Street. The move took a month, and men worked after their shifts or on weekends. At its peak, Crested Butte had 8 fraternal organizations. When the big mine closed in 1952, the Croatian Hall was sold 7 years later in 1959 to Dr. Hubert Smith of Texas, who used it for his Law Science Academy. The 4 remaining lodges met in Frank Yelenick's home. He was an officer of each one of them. As more people moved out of town, the lodges ceased to exist. The women of Crested Butte were great cooks: kobasi, sausage; hamjut, soup and stew; pavitica, nut bread; and potitsa, kind of a sweet roll. All nationalities had heroes, and the Slavs had theirs, and his name was Peter Sibic of Serbia. In Crested Butte in 1911, he lifted the wheels off a narrow gauge flat car right off the tracks. He also held on each arm a team of Joe Akers draft horses, pulling his arms together and setting the horses back on their haunches. Crested Butte also had a great baseball team. A guy named Jap Pitzer was the pitcher. Later on, he pitched in the high minor leagues. Tony Mihelic was the shortstop. With Jap Pitzer and Tony Mihelic on the team and other good baseball players, Crested Butte very rarely lost to Gunnison, and they always won a lot of money from the bets on the games. Names were altered in Crested Butte for immigrants. Frank Arajum was renamed O'Raisin by a school teacher. Peep Kudnisic was renamed Kissimmee Quick by his neighbors. There's John and Rosman and his wife of Rosman's Ranch. Now, when my dad came from Belgium, his name was George, but his real name was Joseph. When I told my sisters that, they didn't believe me. And I said, Mom, is that true? And they said, yeah, because when he came to the United States, the Belgians couldn't pronounce Joseph. So they said Jos, and Jos became George. And every immigrant had a story like that. The Italians were the largest initial group in Crested Butte. They and all the immigrants brought their customs, tradition, music, art, language with them, philology. Richard and Cara Grary wrote a tremendous book about the Italians in Crested Butte. Rich was here from 31 to 46. It's called The Spaghetti Gang, and I hope all of you have a chance to read it. All immigrants were connected in some way with the coal mines, and because of all the nationalities in Crested Butte, they became very cosmopolitan. Very early, a lot of trouble between ethnic groups, fights, shootings, ostracism came. Now, I went through the same kind of thing in Upper Michigan. I remember I wanted to date a Finnish girl named Lucille Lund. I was able to take her to the prom. My family wasn't happy. The Belgians weren't happy. The Finns weren't happy. When I got to the prom, you could have cut the tension with a steak knife. I had her home by about 9:15, about 15 minutes, and that was it. Well, it doesn't happen today, thank goodness. I interviewed Mrs. Sarah Allen, who had lived in Crested Butte. He was born in Crested Butte in 1883, now lived in Grand Junction. Her name then was Thompson. I interviewed her in 1971 when she was about 88 years old. She remembered the town when it was Anglo and when the Southeast Europeans came in. She told me that the Italian women used to bake their bread in the coke ovens at Big Mine Hill, and Anglo kids would gather around and just watch. A can of beer would be passed around, and when finished, another can of beer made the rounds. One Italian family, she said, otherwise clean as a whistle, kept a cow in the kitchen in the evening. Peter Rollo, an Italian, involved in a knifing incident in 1900, returned with a gun and began shooting, wounding one. The Elk Mountain Pilot newspaper declared, quote, "The Italians make good citizens after becoming Americanized." Much of the trouble in Crested Butte became as a result of Greek, Italian, Black, and other strikebreakers were brought into town. In 1913, a Greek man was shot in the neck by an Italian in Little Italy. He recovered, but when news spread, 25 Greeks came down from Floresta to protect their own people. You're getting a good look there at Frank Starica on the right and one of his customers on the left. And they got a picture of the hose company right in front of the city hall across from Cochever's today. And Frank and Gal Starica ran one of the greatest bars that ever existed in Crested Butte. The man that Peter Rollo shot recovered, but now the 25 Greeks came down from Floresta to protect their people. Sheriff Pat Hanlon of Gunnison came in to end a war which involved the Greeks and the Italians. He put down the war, but the war had broken out because an Italian daughter was dating a Greek. Kind of like my situation with a Belgian dating a Finn. Mike Welch, half Slavic, started the La Cabria soda water bottling company in 1899, producing cider, soda water, mineral water, root beer, birch beer, and ginger ale. The immigrant people of Crested Butte did their washing on Mondays, the only day the coke ovens weren't operating, hence clean clothes. There's a shot of Cochever's bar. On the right is Josiah. Next to him is Cheat Sedmak. On the next to him is Pitzer Sporsic. And way over on the left is Tommy Sneller. And the bartender was Chuck Wirtz. Later wound up in Bisbee, Arizona. In 1970, I interviewed Philip Yaklich, who was 85 years old. Born in Slovenia in 1885, later Yugoslavia. Came to the U.S. on a French ship in 1904. Went to Pueblo, then Irwin. Before coming to Crested Butte, he worked in the coal mines of southern Colorado at Trinidad and then northern New Mexico. In Crested Butte, he worked at the Buckley, the Peanut, the Smith Hill, the Robinson, and the Pueblo mines, along with Floresta. And when he worked at the Buckley, he rode a horse to and from work, about a mile each way. Now there you got a good look at people. This is John Gibson coming with another man whose name I don't know in 1927 from the Buckley mine back into Crested Butte. And that's what Philip Yaklich did, riding a horse. In Crested Butte, as I said, he worked at all those mines. The miners were paid on the contract system. You were paid, Philip said, on how much you produced. If you hit rock or the roof fell in, you cleaned it up without pay. Philip called those idle days. While working at the Buckley, he met Joe Berta, the man of the mountains, also called Joe Peanuts for the peanuts that he gave kids. Joe Berta had been at the Ludlow Massacre, one of the great, interesting people of the Gunnison country. He's buried at Baldwin up Ohio Creek. Philip's wife's maiden name was Cochever, daughter of Jake Cochever, who came to Crested Butte in 1884. She was born 10 years later in 1894. Jake Cochever opened up the peanut mine and started Cochever's Saloon a little after 1900. She was the first Slovenian child born in Crested Butte. Her mother ran a boarding house for 24 in the early days, and many of the Slavs who stayed there stayed home at night to avoid getting beaten up. There you get a good look at the Bottenfield Ranch just south of Crested Butte, and those guys in 1917 have been drafted into World War I. They're going off to fight in the war. Fortunately, every one of them returned. When Mrs. Yaklich got married there at the boarding house, there was a big reception. 12 Irishmen came to the hall where the reception was. When asked if they had been invited, they said no. Mrs. Yaklich said, "If you come in, look what's waiting for you." And 50 big Austrians were there. And the wedding was the last one that was ever interrupted. The Ku Klux Klan was very big in Crested Butte, Colorado, and the U.S. in the 1920s. And there you get a good look at that mob in the 1920s in Gunnison. They held parades in town. They burned crosses on Chocolate Peak at the west end of town. The Klan hated Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and blacks. H.L. Mencken, the great writer, said, "It gave the village idiot a chance to dress up in sheets and hoods and engage in hocus pocus. One could always tell who the Klan members were when they were marching because their dogs followed them right down the street. So if you knew where the dogs came from, you knew who the guy was." Finally, courageous newspaper editors and the IRS took them down. There you get a good shot. This is 1919 on Elk Avenue. You can see City Hall in the background, Rosich's Bar on the left, now the Public House, and they are marching on the 1-year anniversary at the end of World War I, November the 11th, 1919, Elk Avenue, Crested Butte. Crested Butte had a lot of prejudice early, but never had any ghettos. Too small for that. Disease was impartial. Mines were dangerous for all. And time had a way of healing things. It was ironic that the Slavic minority finally got acceptance. And when they got acceptance, they were now the dominant group in Crested Butte and no longer needed it. There's Pitzer Sporsic at Kochivers, one of the great old timers of Crested Butte. One Slavic writer from Crested Butte wrote the following, and I quote, "The sorrows and struggles, the hopes of the first and second generations left scarcely any marks on the present third, which by its education, standards, and ambitions can no more be considered Slavic at all. Having in some cases changed their name for convenience, they are now American and nothing else, justifying the hopes of immigration." There's a good shot of my buddy Whitey Sporsic on the main drag of Crested Butte, not far from his home in the 1970s. The first and second generations of Crested Butte never developed their full potential. The greatest memorial to those people will always be their work ethic, the fun they had, the strength in the face of very great hardship, their music, their dances, and their very neat homes and their gardens. And there's a picture of all the old timers lined up by the depot. Amax Corporation gave them a tour when Amax was trying to open up the molybdenum mine. And one last thing about the contributions or memorial. The sacrifices of those people for their children gave their children what they never had, and what they did and what they gave them made the U.S. the greatest and most revered nation in the world, and Crested Butte one of the most important coal towns in the country. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. We are now getting ready for the trivia question.